Up next is Project 4, also known as the 99 Squares. This is an exercise in digital color mixing that incorporates 3 distinct designs, each emphasizing one of 3 color properties: value, temperature, and intensity. Let's get started. In the end, you will end up with something that looks like this: a grid of 99 different colors. This project will help us to better identify, describe, and mix colors digitally. For this demo, I will be working in and getting you familiar with Photoshop, but you are more than welcome to use any digital program of your choice. To get started, we need to open the file named project4_composition_template, a JPEG file. On this file, you will see 3 blank grids, one representing value, one representing temperature, and one representing intensity. Below each grid is a key: bright and dull for intensity, warm and cool under temperature, and light and mid-tone underneath value. Next, you will create 3 unique compositions using this template: one for value, one for temperature, and one for intensity. We can use the brush tool, seen here, to fill in our grids to create our unique compositions. To fill out your grid, you may want to create a separate layer to work on. To create a new layer, click in the upper right-hand corner of the Layers window. Select New Layer. I have named my layer Fill. Click on the Layers option here. It will be set to normal. You should switch it to Multiply so you can see the grid underneath your painting as you fill it in. Next, using the color palette, choose a color to fill in your grid with. I'm using gray. It really doesn't matter what color you choose, as long as you can see your grid underneath. Using your brush, begin filling in your grid and designing your 3 unique compositions. It's best to use a hard-edged brush, not something that's too blurry or fuzzy. If needed, increase the hardness on your brush in the brush options. If it's easier for you, you can use the rectangular marquee tool to select the areas of the grid that you want to fill in. Using your brush tool, fill in your selected areas. The marquee tool will keep your edges nice and clean and keep you from painting in undesired areas. You should end up with something like this: 3 unique designs, one for value, one for temperature, and one for intensity. Approximately 50% of your squares should be filled in. 49 to 51 squares filled in will work best. Make sure your 3 compositions are unique and take up different areas of your grids. Now take a look at the keys on the bottom of each grid. For value, your blank squares represent light colors and your dark squares represent midtones. For temperature, the blank squares represent warms, the filled-in squares represent cools, and for intensity, the white squares represent brights, and the filled-in squares represent dull colors. To get started on the next step, you will need to open up the file named project4_99squares_template, a PSD file. This is the file we will be painting on. If you're working in Procreate or another digital program that won't recognize the PSD file, feel free to use the file labeled Procreate. Our next step is to label each one of these squares on our grid to tell us what color to paint them in. To do this, we are referring back to our 3 original compositions. Let's begin by looking at the square in the upper left-hand corner. In my value composition, I have that squared filled in. That means it's going to be a mid-tone. On my temperature composition, I also have that square filled in. That means it will be a cool color. And lastly, in my intensity grid, I left that square blank. That means it will be a bright color. So that first square will be a mid-tone, cool, bright. Using the type tool in Photoshop and making sure my type layer is selected, I named this layer abbreviations in your file. I will go ahead and label that square accordingly with the abbreviation MCB, Midtone Cool Bright. This abbreviation will later tell us what color to paint our square in. Let's move on to the square just to the right of our first square. Going back to my 3 original compositions, in my value grid, I have that square filled in, so that means it will be a midtone. On my temperature grid, I left that square blank. That means it will be a warm color. And on my intensity grid, I also left that square blank. That means it will be a bright color. So in the end, we will have a midtone, warm, bright. Let's label that square accordingly now, using our type tool again. I will fill in that square with the abbreviation MWB for midtone, warm, bright. Let's move on to the next square as my final example as to how to fill in the abbreviations and label your squares accordingly. On my value grid, I left that square blank, so that means it will be a light color. On my temperature grid, I have it filled in, therefore it will be a cool color, and on my intensity grid, I left it blank. That means it will be a bright color. So in the end, we will have a light, cool, bright. Using my type tool, I will fill in my abbreviation LCB. Finish filling out your abbreviations on your grid accordingly. Again, these abbreviations will tell you what color to paint each square. Once you have your abbreviations all filled out, it is now time to start painting. It is a good idea to lock your type layer, the layer named abbreviations. Lock it by clicking on the little lock icon. This will prevent you from accidentally clicking on and painting on your type layer. We will be filling in and painting these squares on the layer named Layer 1. It is a good idea to start by painting your midtones first and ignore your light colors. We will begin painting by using the magic wand tool to select each square. Make sure your tolerance at the top of the page is set to 10. Click on your square to select it. You will know your square is selected when you see the moving dashed line around the square. We will be mixing our colors using the color palette seen here. If your color palette is not seen in your workspace, simply go to Window and select Color. Click in the upper right-hand corner of the color palette window. You will see various options for different sliders, such as CMYK, RGB, HSB, etc. I would like you to work with the CMYK sliders, since they are the closest to mixing actual paint, and give you better control over your color mixtures. Play around with the CMYK sliders to get familiar with them. The percentages to the right-hand side of the sliders indicate how much of that color was added. Let's start mixing color for our first square, which is labeled a midtone cool bright. Let's not overcomplicate this. Let's simply slide the cyan all the way to 100%. That is a nice example of a midtone cool bright color. If you're confused about what is a warm color and what is a cool color, simply refer back to the color wheel. Anything from red, violet to yellow, green is a warm color, and anything from green to violet is a cool color. To fill in our first square, I will be using the paint bucket tool. It can be found here. Using the paint bucket tool, simply click on the square you wish to fill in. There we go. I have my first square finished, a midtone, cool, bright. When you're finished filling a square, remember to deselect it. Hit Command D to deselect, or click Select at the top of the page and then deselect. This pure cyan is a nice example of a mid-tone cool bright. Of course, I could have also painted this square a blue-green or a blue-violet or a pure green, any color on the cool side of the color wheel. Next, let's move on to our next square, which is labeled a mid-tone warm bright. Again, using my magic wand to select that square. A nice example of a mid-tone warm bright would simply be a pure red. Using my CMYK sliders, I slid the magenta and the yellow all the way over to 100% to achieve that pure red color. Another good example of a mid-tone warm bright would have been orange or even a red-violet. Also note that I am keeping this red color very saturated by not allowing myself to mix in any cyan or black. I am keeping my cyan and my black slider at 0% because I want this to be a bright color. If you have forgotten how you've mixed a color and you want to reuse that color, you can use the eyedropper tool, seen here. Next, I will work on the square just below our first cyan square, which is a mid-tone warm bright. A reddish orange will work nicely for that square. I mix this orange simply by lowering the magenta. Let's move on to that mid-tone cool bright square to the right of our orange square. I want to reuse some of that cyan. Let's add a bit of magenta to that cyan and use that for that square. A nice representation of a mid-tone cool bright. Let's work on some mid-tone dulls next. I'm going to reuse some of that red tone that I originally made, and I'm going to dull it down by adding a bit of cyan and a bit of black to it and use it for that square here. A nice example of a mid-tone warm dull color. Let's do an example of a mid-tone cool dull color right here. Using the eyedropper, I'm going to go ahead and grab that cyan again, and I can dull that down by adding magenta and yellow, because orange is the complement of blue, and when you add a complement to a color, it will dull it down. I could have also dulled down this blue by adding black to it. Let's do one more example of a mid-tone cool dull color. I'm going to reuse some of that other blue that I am mixed, again adding a bit of black to it as well as some orange to it to dull it down. Let's do another example of a mid-tone warm dull. I'm going to reuse that orange color, and I simply dulled it down by increasing the amount of cyan in it, giving us sort of a brown tone. Once you have filled in all of your mid-tones, you can now move on to your light colors. Try to keep these light colors very, very light. On the CMYK sliders, don't go past 20%. For this light, cool, bright square, I have simply pushed my cyan slider over to 18% and left the others at 0%. For the light, warm, bright, a yellow would be a nice example of a light, warm, bright. Please reserve your yellow colors for your light squares only. I want to reuse this yellow color for my light, warm, dull right below it. To dull down this yellow, I will simply slide over the cyan and slide over the magenta to dull down that yellow color. Technically, this yellow is now dulled down because I've added violet to it. Violet is yellow's complement. Let's do another example of a light, warm, bright. For this one, I'm simply going to mix a pink by moving my magenta slider slightly over to the right. And for this light, warm, dull color, I will be reusing that magenta and simply adding cyan and a bit of yellow to it to dull it down. To know if a color is dull or not, simply look at your CMYK sliders. If all 4 sliders are slid over to the right to some degree, that will be a dull color because now you have all 3 of the primaries mixed in. Again, refer back to project 1 and how we made our gray tone. Hopefully my demoed mixtures will give you an idea of how to get started. Go through and mix all of the different colors for your grids according to how they are labeled. In the end, you will end up with something that looks like this. 99 completely different colors. It's okay if they look similar, but they all need to be unique. Be sure to turn in your project with your abbreviations clicked on, so that way I can see what each individual mixture is supposed to be. Take a look at your finished piece. You should be able to clearly see your value composition that you originally did in your finished piece. If you cannot see your value composition, you may have to increase the contrast and lighten up your light squares. The temperature composition will be a little bit harder to see, but if you squint your eyes, you might be able to make out your warm and cool tones. And of course, the intensity grid is going to be the most difficult to see. The value grid should be the easiest to see. Again, the whole idea of this project is to help us to better identify, describe, and mix colors digitally. Have patience with yourself and try not to go cross-eyed. Let's give our first digital project a try.